Welcome everybody to today's webcast about the 2015 Manitoba NDP Convention. I'm Jared Wesley, and I'm happy to be joined here by three experts in Manitoba politics to talk about what we can expect from the race going forward, and also what's happened to date, because it's been a confusing experience for those that haven't lived it, and even for to today's webcast about getting some feedback here. Hang on a second. Manitoba. It's been confusing for folks that are both inside Manitoba and especially those of us from outside, so we appreciate our experts for joining us today. Very quick introductions, because they need no introductions in the world of Manitoba politics. We'll start off with Bruce Owen, who's a reporter with the Winnipeg Free Press. Years, dare I say decades of experience in reporting on issues like this, so we're glad to have Bruce with us. Curtis Brown, VP of Probe Research, expert in public opinion in Manitoba, is here to join us as well, and Andrea Rounce, Assistant Professor of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba. Can't resist plugging her new book, co-edited by me, called Disengaged. It's a book on the last Manitoba election, 2011. It's available in bookstores now. So with that free plug, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce to kick off our discussion about the 2015 Manitoba NDP Leadership Race. Bruce.
Well, Jared, thanks for having me, and hello everybody. Larry Cush and I, my partner here at the Legislative Bureau, we are counting down the minutes until Sunday, until we know who will win this race. Because for us and a lot of other media in town, and obviously for the campaigns and for the NDP, it's been a long 4 months of this, and it's been an awful. I guess the big question we have, right, out of Sunday is, can the NDP recover in time for the April 2016 general election? And we've seen similar circumstances in other provinces, you know, BC, Ontario, where a change in leadership has helped the governing party stay in power. The NDP are counting on it, that formula working for them in 2016, because of what's happened here in this province over the last few months. You know, it's anyone's guess what's going to happen. Most of us are predicting a change in government.
All right, Bruce, if I could just lean on you for a minute to give us a sense of where the candidates sit in terms of constituents, delegates, support, union support, and the rest heading into the weekend.
You know, I wish I could, Jared. I wish I could give you facts, right, on who's got what delegate support, both from the 57 constituencies, from the affiliated unions, from the provincial council, among MLAs, but I can't, because each camp keeps different statistics, right? Each camp releases, we've got so many constituency delegate supports, these are our union endorsements. I'm of the mind, roughly, they're running neck and neck in this. And so that it's anyone's guess, really. First of all, how many delegates actually show up? 2,200 roughly were eligible. We are likely only to see about maybe slightly more than 1,700 show up, paid delegates. It's a secret ballot, right? And from what I've seen over the last few weeks, a delegate will say, yeah, we're supporting you, right? And the candidate, and then cross their fingers, but do that and holding it behind their back in swearing allegiance, because they're going to do something else. Again, that secret ballot, we fully expect, right, either Teresa, Oswald, or Greg Selinger to fall off the first ballot, right? Steve Ashton seemingly has the upper hand in constituency and union endorsements. what happens after that, it's anyone's guess. We are going into this essentially with no preconceived idea of who will win. And should someone fall off that first ballot, who will support whom? Really, there is so much bad blood within the NDP that conceivably, if the Premier falls off after the first ballot, is it conceivable he's going to say, throw his delegate support behind Teresa Oswald? I don't think so. Would he support Steve Ashton, whom he ran against in 2009 and beat? You tell me. Realistically, perhaps they're just going to release their delegates and say, vote for whoever you want, or just go home. So this Sunday is going to be very telling. The other problem, I guess, with the NDP have, that it's 1,700 people. Only 1,700 privileged few are going to be deciding who, or confirming, or who is going to be the province's next premier. Right? The rest of us are just watching the show unfold, and that's. Is it right that under that delegate process, that not the party membership, but delegates who could afford, to pay the fees, or had the fees pay for them, for instance, attend this convention and pick the next premier of our province?
Well, it's a good point, and for the uninitiated, and I'm sure Andrea and Curtis will get to this as well. For the uninitiated, this is a traditional delegated convention with constituency delegates, some of whom are pledged to support certain candidates, but as you said, even the pledged delegates, we're not sure how they would vote on the second ballot, certainly, but on the first ballot, no clue. Then there is a series of union delegates, many of whose spots at the convention have not been claimed. They can't actually fill in all of the seats that they're entitled to. And then there's the youth wing that has its own 94 votes, I think is what they're entitled to, 91 of which we're told are going to Teresa Oswald. So just a bit of background for folks that maybe aren't quite sure how the process works. That's how it's working. But as Bruce says, it's going down to the wire on Sunday with a real open convention.
So out of this, what will be debated during convention normal business, right, on Saturday is one member, one vote, right? Is what we're doing, is it democratic? Is this the democratic way to pick a new leader, where the unions seemingly have undue influence, right, on who the province's next premier should be, or will they challenger remain? So we'll obviously be there Saturday and find out even if this meets there's three resolutions, whether they hit the floor or not, or just put over to another convention, which is probably likely, right? But still, it's going to be a discussion. Is this the way Manitoba's premier should be decided? A lot of us don't think so.
Well, let's hear from Curtis. Curtis, I don't know if you're going to touch on that, but if you could unmute your lines and let us know from your perspective what you're looking for this weekend and what we can expect.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot, Jared. That's great, and thank you very much for having me come and be part of this. This is fun. I wasn't specifically going to address that particular question about whether or not it is right. I did write an op-ed recently, just kind of raising it as an open question about whether or not that is something that should happen. Because I think, as Bruce says, it's with more and more sort of emphasis on the leader, of the party. I think this is something that's going to be people are sort of wondering about the legitimacy of that, about having a small group of people running it. Or deciding who should be the next premier. But I want to talk a little bit, I guess, about sort of what I see as kind of being the two leadership race dynamics, kind of that has sort of taken us up to now in this particular race. So really, what I'm talking about here is sort of the external, outside of the party context, which is the public opinion context, which is kind of the world that I live in on a daily basis here at Probe Research. We do polling every quarter for Bruce's newspaper, the Winnipeg Free Press, and we've been tracking a lot of the, what Manitobans are thinking about the NDP and what they're thinking about the important issues in the province. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I want to talk about the internal dynamics of the race and kind of what it means for the NDP and sort of what's going to be, I think, happening over the next little while and what the likely outcome will be. So just to give you a quick, sort of a quick overview, in a lot of ways, public opinion and sort of the up and down of the polls, has played a really major role in terms of precipitating this whole leadership fight, where really, the argument kind of against Greg Selinger was that he's become too unpopular and he's dragging the party down in the polls, and they don't stand a good chance of winning the next election unless they make a change. And so, and we've, like I say, we've been tracking this basically since, we've been tracking these quarterly polling results in Manitoba for almost 20 years, and really what we've seen kind of since the last, certainly since the last election, is that the NDP have really started to go on a major slide. There's kind of been four key phases kind of as this is all unfolded. So you see on the very left there at the last election, the NDP won 46% of the vote, and the Tories won 43% of the vote. But because of the way the first past the post system works and the fact the NDP were relatively strong in Winnipeg, they won 37 seats. Sort of what I would call the pre-PST increase phase. I guess it was spring of 2013 in the budget. The provincial government raised the PST by 1%. At that point, it was starting to trail the Tories a little bit, and often we see this in between elections, but what ended up happening is once the PST increase came in, of course, they went on a fairly big tumble, one that we'd never really seen before, where they got down into the high 20% range. And a lot of that support went to the Liberals, who are now, typically, they got 8% in the last election. They're up into the high teens, low 20s. We started to see the NDP recover a little bit over the last year, but then once this current leadership crisis hit, they really went back down again. And in the last poll that we did in December, they were at 26% support. The Tories were at 48. The Liberals were at 19. So really, like Bruce says, they have a major hole to dig out of if they want to win the next election. There is a little bit of hope, though. This graph shows just the numbers within Winnipeg. The last one was Manitoba. And this really shows that it is a lot more competitive within the city of Winnipeg, although again here the Tories seem to be going up during those periods where the NDP really has started to tumble down, and a lot of the support sort of that has left the NDP has gone over to the Liberals, who are now in the 20s in Winnipeg. One of the keys for the NDP is to, one of the reasons they've been so successful in Manitoba over the last few years is that they've been extremely popular among female voters, particularly in Winnipeg and suburban parts of the city. And this just shows that they've really lost that support since the, basically since the time of the last election, and a lot of that has gone over to the Liberals. It's interesting, the Tory number is actually fairly flat when you look at it over the last few years in terms of their support among women. They're at about 40% right now. With leadership approval ratings, this is another big piece of it. I think it's no surprise. Greg Selinger at one time actually had fairly positive approval ratings, and they've just gone right into the toilet now with the majority of Manitobans disapproving of the job that he's doing as leader. And this kind of shows you what it looks like over the last couple of years. So his basically have been cut in half, and meanwhile Brian Ballister's have, the Conservative Party leader here, they've gone up a fair bit. Now, I mentioned the PST hike, and one of the things, one of the key aspects of it was whether or not Manitobans bought the argument about PST and whether or not it was necessary, as the government said, or whether or not the government could have found money for some of the things that it was supposed to fund. And really, I think these two things are closely tied together: the NDP's drop in support, and then also the hike in the PST. And the issue and how people feel about that. The majority of Manitobans really don't think it was necessary. No one likes to pay more taxes, and I think this kind of goes to show you what has happened. So that kind of gives you the external flavor. And so against all that backdrop, that's kind of led to this battle within the NDP. I think in terms of deciding who should be, who's the best candidate to lead in the next election. If you sort of think of what constitutes the NDP coalition in Manitoba, it's a pretty broad tent, and it includes a lot of different organizations. And so I've tried to sort of sit down and kind of classify, what these groups are. And you sort of see, it's typically organizations that sort of would, or people that kind of be like-minded with, the NDP in a lot of provinces. So different union representatives, activist groups, Northern Manitobans, blue-collar workers, increasingly, growing numbers of New Canadians and Aboriginal people in the province are playing an important role. And the key sort of to the NDP being so successful here in the last little while is they've really won over what I would call suburban moderates, who are people who typically live in South and West Winnipeg and who may vote Liberal federally or even Conservative federally, or for right of centre candidates at other levels of government. But they've really attached to the NDP, and in some ways I think they've been lost by what's happened with the PST increase and just kind of the length of time that the NDP have been in power. So that's kind of something that I think that they sort of have to get back if they're going to try to win. In terms of the dynamics of the leadership race, I think what we're seeing right now in this race is largely a repeat of what we saw in 2009. These are the three candidates that ran, and two of them, of course, are running for the leadership again. The only difference is that Andrew Swan, the fellow in the middle, had sort of the different blocks of support that are now kind of supporting Teresa Oswald. And what ended up happening last time is when Andrew Swan couldn't win, his support was thrown to Greg Selinger as a way of kind of keeping Steve Ashton from becoming the premier, and Greg Selinger is allowed to win. And I think that's been fractured. In terms of each of the candidates have kind of run sort of different strategies, I think, and appealed to different groups of voters. Really, Greg Selinger's strategy has been to govern, run a very low-key campaign, shore up support behind the scenes. He has a lot of support, obviously among the caucus still, among certain unions. Although, as Bruce mentioned, it's a question whether how many of them will support him. What's really telling is a lot of the sort of key party organizers and the staff within the party have kind of left him and gone to Teresa Oswald. And he really, I think, is in some ways, on a broader level, alienated suburban moderates. So I think for him, the key for him is he has to win on the first ballot, I think, in order to have a chance. And I think, as this is unfolded, that's not going to happen. That's extremely unlikely. And I think his chances of winning the next election would be fairly low. For Teresa Oswald, she's run kind of a different sort of campaign. She's sort of been running as if she is the premier, really kind of making the argument that she's the one who's best suited to beat the Conservatives in the next election. I think, in a lot of ways, she is a lot of her support in the party has come from people who are kind of party activists, exempt staff. Her support is kind of among suburban moderates in Winnipeg. But the problem for her is that she was one of the people who went public with the criticisms against Greg Selinger, and I think in the NDP and the labor movement, breaking solidarity is an unforgivable sin. And I think that could potentially hurt her chances, even though in some ways, she may very well be right. She may have the best chance of beating the Conservatives in the next election. And I know when I talk to Conservatives, she's the candidate they're most afraid of having to face in the next campaign. For Steve Ashton, he's sort of built on his, what he did in 2009, but I think he's kind of run as a third option compromise candidate, as someone who's going to bring the party together. A lot of his support has been, he has more support than he did last time among caucus, and he also has a significant amount of support among Northern Manitobans, New Canadians, Aboriginal Manitobans. But I think the challenges for him is that he's sort of not considered by a lot of observers as being that viable in a general election, and he's also the longest-serving MLA. He's been the MLA since 1981, so he doesn't exactly represent the face of change. But at the same time, he could be seen as a potential compromise, because unlike in 2009, the bloc in the party that's supporting Teresa Oswald, the bloc that's supporting Greg Selinger, are probably not likely to come together towards each other, and that could be beneficial for Steve Ashton. So what happens on Sunday? Like I said, I think there will definitely be a second ballot. I think some of the key things that I'll be watching for is whether or not Teresa Oswald in particular can survive round one. Survive the first ballot. It sort of looks, just based on the initial numbers, that she might not, but there's some, like lot of questions about how many delegates will actually end up showing up to support each of the candidates, and especially with Greg Salinger's union support. And really the question is whether or not anyone but Phil and the candidate here will materialize like it did last time. But I mean, if someone held a gun to my head and I had to make a bet just based on all the dynamics, I'd say this is the likeliest outcome. I think at the end of it, I think it'll be the compromise candidate that ends up winning this, just based on the number of delegates that he has already and just the dynamics of the race so far. But in a delegated convention, crazy things can happen. I watched in Montreal when Stéphane Dion became the leader of the Liberal Party in 2006, and I don't think anyone expected that. And I don't think, I think we could all end up being very surprised on Sunday.
Great. Well, thanks, Curtis. I don't know if Andrea wants to take a bet with you on an Ashton outcome or not.
I have a bet with someone else about this. I won't say what it's for, but that's I do have a little wager going.
Fair enough. And just to add to your Dion comment, that exact same weekend, Ed Stelmach was elected.
That's right. I remember that very well, and then that was also a surprise.
Yeah, and dark horse compromise candidates have had a history of winning these sorts of three-way races.
Yeah.
With that, I'll turn it over. Thank you, Curtis. Turn it over to Andrea. Andrea, your thoughts on what we can expect and some of the implications of what happens on Sunday?
Right. Well, Curtis, thank you for. Actually, it was good I didn't have my camera on because I had my mouth wide open. I was like, really? That's fascinating. You were the first person that I've heard predict an Ashton win, so I will be interested in talking to you about a potential discussion. Anyway, just a few things that I wanted to follow up on that Bruce had raised and Curtis had raised as well. Part of the process that's well, there are two things that I think have potential impact for the process on Sunday. One is that this was originally scheduled as a policy convention, so this is in a small venue. They were certainly not expecting 1,700 people coming in person to do this, and they weren't able to secure a larger location for the convention. So they're in, I think they have a ballroom that maybe seats 500 people, 400 people, rather than being in the convention center where they could fit all of those delegates. So the question that I have is, how many of those delegates go away after the first ballot? How do you ensure that communication happens among the people who are there, who need to come back and vote, that kind of thing, as well as how they're managing the northern balloting process. And I haven't heard very much about that, whether or not the ballots themselves look the same, whether they're doing some kind of preferential or ranking ballot with the northern candidates. I'm not sure, and maybe you guys know. But I think there are some.
It's a very good point, Andrea. Can I just ask you for a favor? Could you just tilt your camera down a bit? Just you're getting cut off by the videos at the bottom. Is that possible?
Yes.
There we
Better?
go. Perfect.
Yes.
Thank you.
Good. So yes, I don't know, and again, we are still not entirely sure how many delegates will actually cast ballots in the north as well as in Winnipeg. But this is something that probably the appeals committee will have to be dealing with after the convention's over. So some of the impacts that I just wanted to mention, I think. My area of focus is often public administration, so I'm thinking about what's happening in terms of the public service and what's been happening over the last 4 months that this uncertainty has been going on. So I think in terms of just what happens after March 8th, there will be a series of things that will happen within the public service. It's unusual to have this kind of campaign running. In election campaigns, there's a lot of rules about what the public service, what the public administration does, what they can do, what they can't do, how they operate, and there aren't those kinds of rules that exist during this kind of competition, even though it looks a lot like an election would look. So we've seen a lot of things slowing down despite the fact that processes continue. So governments are, they're working through the budget process, they're in estimates, they're making decisions about budgeting, but in fact the premier might change, right? So, and cabinet might change, and there's probably a pretty good chance that both of those things will happen. So there will be some significant impacts on what government does going forward, and what that means for public administrators is that there's a lot of shifting and a lot of short-term accommodation that will need to happen. in terms of, there's a budget coming soon-ish, whether we're looking now at the end of March, if we're looking into mid-April, the House will be sitting. All of those kinds of things will happen in very short order.
I don't want to interrupt, but the sticky wicket is the PAW by-election. That has to be called too.
Right. Yes.
And then that restricts whatever the government looks like after Monday from making announcements, cutting ribbons, and doing all that thing. That's
Absolutely, I agree. And it's been a funny time, and Curtis said that, Teresa Oswald has been running this as a leader, as a leadership campaign, much more so, I think, than Steve Ashton has. There have been announcements consistently coming out of her campaign. Not as many from Steve Ashton's, but there are also, there are these competing policy ideas or competing programmatic and spending ideas that are out there as well that will need to be built into this process somehow. I think in terms of what I see happening in the next election, and I'll just echo what Bruce and Curtis said in terms of where the NDP is at, they clearly will have some significant work to do within the party in terms of rebuilding, in terms of managing conflict and divisions and those kinds of things. And they have a year. So we'll see what they can accomplish within that time. I'm not particularly optimistic that they're going to be able to get to a place where they can launch a campaign that puts them ahead of the other parties, but you never know what can happen. In terms of the opposition, I was interested to see Curtis's numbers about leader popularity. And one of the things that I've noted throughout this process is that the opposition leaders have been not very present or not very public throughout the process. And the question that arises is whether or not this was a calculated choice, whether this was sit back and let the NDP destroy themselves, or was this an example of where opposition parties might have made more use of the disarray within the party for their own purposes and to raise their profile and to compare themselves hopefully favorably against the NDP leadership campaigners. And I think ultimately there will be questions coming into the next election on accountability, on responsibility, on no matter who leads, whether or not this is a party that people in Manitoba can trust, and whether or not they can trust the people who are leading the party to take them forward into the next election and past that in terms of whatever they choose for their government. So I think there are a number of things that Manitobans are going to have to consider pretty carefully going into the next election.
A question I have is whether everything that's happened to the NDP over the past 4 months, whether that will increase voter engagement in April 2016 or not. Yeah. Will it feed into that that cynicism we've seen in the process where people will just say, hey, the NDP, they're no different than anybody else. They're at the trough and they're only in it for themselves. I'm staying home. I'm not going to vote for anybody. Is there any feeling about that, or that this is good or bad for voter apathy?
Bruce, I think one thing to keep in mind, kind of as maybe a counterpoint to that, is that if people think that this is an opportunity to elect a new government, sometimes that can lead to higher levels of voter turnout. That often happens in a lot of federal elections or past provincial elections where where that's been the case, where people sort of are then excited about, okay, now like there's actually an opportunity here to vote for someone else. I remember voter turnout just plummeted between the 1999 election in Manitoba and 2003 because every poll said that the NDP were going to win 40-some seats and wipe the Tories off the map back then. And I think if it's sort of seen to be, one, more competitive, and two, something where perhaps the Conservatives actually have an excellent chance of forming the government and throwing the NDP out after 16 years, that may actually motivate some more people to turn out. But I think it's all a question about where they do, right? If turnout is higher in Steinbach or southwestern Manitoba, big deal, right? But I think if it's in the suburbs of Winnipeg, particular, that could really be the difference between government and opposition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what I was going to point out too, Curtis. Again, not to plug. Okay, yes, to plug a book.
Go for it.
Age, there's a fabulous chapter on the online campaign written by Curtis, but also a chapter that we have on voter turnout that showed that if there was that sense that this was going to be the closest election in a generation in 2011, and yet Manitobans seem to be able to distinguish between a close race province-wide versus close races at the constituency level. And you're right to point out that even if it is competitive or there's a reason on a province-wide basis to turn out or not to turn out, for some reason, Manitobans are more sophisticated than political observers give them credit for when it comes to determining whether they should turn out to vote. So with that, does anybody know if there's a hashtag for this leadership race?
No, we haven't. We're sticking with MB Poly.
Okay, so for questions that folks may have online, I'm going to suggest one. Maybe you guys can use it this weekend, whatever. Let's use MB NDP LDR. MB NDP LDR for folks that may have questions for our panelists either live or afterwards. And I'll ask the folks here in the audience if they have any questions for our panel about the Manitoba race. Okay, any questions for each other?
Ashton?
Yeah. Why not? Why not? I think that's I think that's a valid thing. I mean, I know I think last time it was a lot different in terms of the dynamics of it. When Andrew Swan lost some of those key constituency races and then threw his support to Salinger, I mean, it was basically a foregone conclusion. I think his campaign looks a lot stronger this time. And I mean, he's done very well in terms of the delegate support. I guess one of the key questions, will be whether I think one of the other advantages that he has is also that for the northern constituencies, it's a mail-in ballot as opposed to having to actually drive from Thompson or the Pas or Flin Flon or Garden Hill to get down to Winnipeg. And so
my understanding
they'll
all be counted Sunday. The ballots will all be counted mail-ins electronic on Sunday. So
sorry, I didn't catch all that, Bruce.
Well, the mail-ins ballots from the north or the 5 remote constituencies, they will all be tabulated Sunday, right? It's not like Canada waiting for Canada Post pony to bring it to Winnipeg. So it'll be a lot.
But that didn't happen. That didn't happen last time, and so I think that could have a major advantage for him for sure.
Is there seriously no rule in place for how those folks from northern Manitoba, whether they'll be able to participate in future rounds or how? Is there seriously no rule for that?
I'm
not 100% sure.
Yeah.
Do you know?
No, I'm not. I was just looking at the leadership rules or the leadership contest rules this morning, and
So they've got one vote, as far as I can tell.
I think they're through the whole thing, is my understanding. So that would kind of defeat the purpose if you got a whole bunch of people voting at once, and then they sort of drift apart, and then you've got. That doesn't sound very democratic to me.
No, it doesn't.
No, I mean, but I haven't heard whether or not they're doing whether they're doing balloting differently, like whether they're doing a preferential ballot for the northern candidates to accomplish that or not.
Yeah, that would make the most sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I have one question for the panel. What's the one major policy promise that each of the candidates has made this time that'll have the biggest impact if they're leaders? I'm thinking, to put it another way, what will be the centerpiece of their platform if they were elected?
Getting elected in 2022, really. Like the promises they've made. Maybe the Manitoba government is under some pressure, regardless of what the promises that have been made during this campaign, to get its finances in order, right, to drive down that deficit. They haven't had much luck over the last number of years. The promises made only add to that deficit. That will not have to help them in a campaign, looking like, foolish financial managers. So you know, Ashton, like for me, I'll just say Ashton, his first promise on the day is to have a referendum on the PST, whether the NDP should keep it or not. That, if he wins, he will wear that. That's a huge gamble by Mr. Ashton to make that type of pledge on asking on doing what the Tories went to court to argue for and give Manitobans, you know, a vote on whether they should keep that 1 point increase to the provincial sales tax. When I heard that, I gasped. I almost died. For Teresa, you know, she's got a number of, you know, really like the poverty announcements, you know, of raising the shelter allowance, which the NDP have declined to do. They only said they'd do it when Mr. Pallister said he'd do it, but then the NDP said they'd do it over a course of 4 years. Now Teresa said, well, we're going to raise the shelter allowance to the 75% medium rate within the first year, right? That's going to be in the next upcoming budget should you become premier. That's a huge cost. So, and Salinger just campaigned on his record, right? Salinger has not made any grandiose statements or anything like that. He's just said, hey, I'm campaigning on what I've done.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think the PST increase, you know, the stances around the PST, I think, are really kind of the most significant thing. So, you know, for Salinger, obviously, it's status quo. I mean, he's the one who made the decision, and that's kind of in some ways what's triggered this. You know, for Teresa Oswald, I think the other thing, I mean, Teresa Oswald has also, I think, promised some sort of like rebates or relief from the PST increase for low-income people, and I think that's, I think that's also, I mean, that is not as expensive. Well, potentially not as expensive, depending on how the referendum goes, and also probably not as controversial as Steve Ashton's call to sort of have a after-the-fact referendum. But yeah, I mean, she's sort of, you know, what I've kind of noticed about a lot of her announcements is it's been interesting. I mean, there's sort of been a lot of things that are sort of very focused on sort of, you know, addressing sort of certain things within the party. So, you know, especially, you know, sort of the focus on low-income individuals and poverty through that promise, and also through raising the shelter allowance. You know, some other things, you know, specific to education and health that she's promised. I think that have, you know, kind of been about doing that. But I think it's tough. Like Bruce says, you know, they do have a deficit. They're not going to announce anything that costs a lot of money. And the other thing is, I mean, they're the government. Like, how can you sort of come out and say, well, you know, this policy has been wrong, and we need to do this, and we need to have this major change, or to do something that kind of fits more with a liberal or Tory policy position. Not that their positions are sort of that radically different, typically from the NDPs in the first place. I mean, they're all, you know, when you sort of think of it on a big continuum, they're all relatively close to each other. It's just that you know, there's some differences in terms of where the emphasis should be.
And I think there's something, you know, aside from maybe the policy is being used to highlight this, but implicitly there's, if you go back to the November announcement, ultimately what we're seeing here, at least in part, is that the Premier is saying, I'm going to govern because that's what I was elected to do, and I'm going to campaign in the evenings and the weekends. Because I stand on principle, and this is what, you know, this is my commitment. And the other candidates will present some alternatives because that's what they said that they weren't allowed to do in cabinet or outside of cabinet, right? So I think there's also partly related in the policy positions that they're taking. There's this reminder, subtle reminder that there's this difference in approach that wasn't necessarily being managed appropriately within the government. So I think there's that governing piece or the governance piece as well that comes through.
And I want to know about how deep is the anger within the NDP against Oswald and the other 4 ministers who resigned and openly criticized the Premier. How deep is that anger of them launching this process, this unprecedented process? And how will that translate on Sunday? Like,
I think
there's some feeling that anger is deep enough, and I don't know how widespread it is, that the best thing for the NDP is to sit in opposition.
Yeah.
You know, that nobody is good enough, that our leadership and we've had these great years in government, and you've thrown it all away. It's time to rebuild. And that I don't understand that. But anyway, that's.
I think Bruce. I think the anger is actually fairly widespread. I think some people will, within the party, may be a little bit more pragmatic about it, and kind of say, you know what, it doesn't matter. Teresa Oswald gives us the best chance to win. But I do think, kind of, when you talk to sort of people, sort of outside of the bubble, or sort of out in the grassroots, I think that's a little, there is a lot of palpable anger out there. I think among New Democrats for what happened. I mean, and we did a poll that, as you know, I didn't show the slide, but one of the things that we asked was whether or not the so-called Gang of Five, as we're calling them, were justified in terms of doing it. And we asked that of Manitobans, even though Manitobans, the majority of Manitobans said yes, they were justified. Among NDP supporters, the majority said no, they weren't. They shouldn't have done that. They should have kept their mouths shut and supported Greg Salinger. He had the opportunity to lead. I just want to make one quick point too with regards to that whole idea of sort of the NDP sort of sitting in the penalty box for at least the term. I think that's kind of the attitude. I think in some respects too, it's also a little bit dangerous because often when parties that have been governing for a long time do that, sort of assuming that the other guys are going to get in for a little while, it's not going to last that long. It could end up lasting quite a bit longer, like you've seen in Saskatchewan or federally with the Liberals, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, my sense of it is that anger comes, at least in part, within the party for people feeling that they have to be forced to choose, right? And that's part of what I think we're seeing, is that they're not feeling like they should be forced to do this. Not only, never mind all of the other rebellion, et cetera, but there are divisions within the legislature, there's divisions within exempt staff, and ultimately, even though arguably you're building capacity, or you're leveraging your capacity currently to run an election in a year, there's no guarantee that all of these people are going to stick around and are going to be invested for the next election.
Hey, we've got one last question from the floor here.
Hi everyone. Just looking at this from an intergovernmental perspective, have there been any sort of policy differences between three candidates on Manitoba's relationship with the federal government or some of the other sister provinces within Confederation? Or have the policy disputes been primarily focused on domestic Manitoban politics?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's. I haven't not that I can recall any sort of key difference in that respect in terms of the relationship with other provinces or the federal government or anything like that. It hasn't really come up.
No, I haven't seen any reference to intergovernmental relations at all.
No, and the only time that I talked to
Looks like we may have lost Bruce midstream there. We still got Andrea and Curtis?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hopefully, I'll got one last question left. Maybe Bruce got pulled in on a story, we'll see. I'll got one last question from the floor here. Yeah.
It kind of relates to the last question, but because it's been mentioned that Salinger has just been sort of taking the I'm going to continue to govern route, in terms of his role at the National Roundtable in Ottawa, did that have much playback in terms of Manitoba and Winnipeg? Because, I mean, I guess presumably that's his sort of governing attitude. That's a really sort of big thing. I just want to know if that's being reflected back home and if that's going to make a difference on Sunday. Maybe not the biggest difference, but what sort of the sound is it sounding back?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
I haven't seen anything really.
There was some media coverage of it, I think, but and the fact that it was actually, I think, kind of remarkable was that he did kind of leave the province to go do that and take part in that roundtable. But whether or not it actually has any kind of effect on the outcome on Sunday, I don't know. I mean, it hasn't really to be honest, I don't think it's really come up with this campaign. I don't know, Bruce, maybe you know. I mean, has anyone, has anyone asked has there been any sort of question of the candidates in terms of where they stand on the missing and murdered women inquiry and what their support is on that?
No, that hasn't come up.
Yeah.
Sorry, on one of the impacts nationally of this NDP leadership fight is at the door. There's obviously a federal campaign already underway, although election, hasn't been officially called. People are hearing at the door that people's feelings against the NDP of Manitoba are also affecting what they think about Thomas Mulcair and the federal opposition. So it's not good.
Yeah. Yeah, and we've seen that even in a little bit of polling that we've done for the federal parties in Manitoba, where their numbers seem to be down quite a bit down from where they were, compared to the last election. And I think there has been some damage, I think, because of what's happened with the provincial NDP. That's also affected the federal party as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you three for joining us today for a fascinating discussion on what to expect this weekend. We've already got better's odds from several of you. Who's going to walk home as premier of the province? So thanks again for taking the time. One last word, Bruce.
This is in terms of what's happening in our province politically, what's going into this weekend. It's historic, and it's fun. It'll be fun to have a front seat on watching history unfold in Manitoba. And Jared and Andrea and Curtis, I fully expect you to write a book on it.
We just finished the last one, man.
The next one is coming.
Stay tuned on that note, stay tuned to the Manitoba Institute for Policy Research website, mipr.ca, for information about that, about politics in Manitoba in general. It's a great source, and just glad to be part of a discussion here today about what to expect. So thanks again for joining us, and thanks everybody for joining us online. Keep the discussion going at hashtag MBNDPLDR. All right, talk to you soon, guys.
Thanks,
Jared.